All right, so let's talk about logical fallacies. I have mentioned this in other lectures, but now we're going to go through and talk about specifically what they are and what kind of types are there, because there's different types of logical fallacies. And it's important to know what they are and to be able to find them so you don't accidentally use them in your argumentation, but it's also important so if you are listening to someone that you actually don't fall for these kinds of things. So that is why it's called a guide to not sound dumb and to not fall for anything. So before we start, we need to break apart what the actual title of these things are. So it's logical, which, logic, reasoning, rationale, how you think. So, or the thought, the thought process. So and then fallacies, that's, you might know the word fallacy or fallible, anything like that. It means flawed or there's an error or something like that. So basically it means there is a thought process or reasoning that is flawed. There's an error. There's a problem with it. So often it is purposeful. Sometimes it's not, but it is important either way to be able to detect them so you don't fall victim for them or to them. So let's look first at this. So birds fly in the sky, airplanes fly in the sky, therefore airplanes are birds. So you need to ask yourself about the line of reasoning there. Is it valid? And it also, you have to realize, what else is it not considering? Does it consider that birds and planes, they both fly in the sky, but they are actually two different things, and that's okay? You have to kind of break things apart when you're looking at logical fallacies. So one thing that we need to talk about is deductive reasoning. So you've probably heard of deductive and inductive reasoning. So right now we're going to look at deductive. And that's when you're presented with a number of statements that support a conclusion. And all the premises in the argument must be completely true to guarantee that the conclusion is valid. So it's basically like you are testing a theory and making sure everything works out and pans out. So a part of deductive reasoning is making sure that the argument is sound. And that's something that you want to have when you write an argument as well, or if you're listening to an argument, is making sure that the argument is sound. So that's basically when all the premises fully support the conclusion, because they all have to back it up and support it. But you could have an unsound argument, or you might hear an unsound argument, and that's what you want to avoid. And it's if one or more of the premises is false, or it does not provide enough support for the conclusion. And you also have to think about fallacies. And if it's an unsound argument, a lot of times it leads to a fallacy, and that's your defect in the reasoning and the rationale. So another type of reasoning that we see a lot is inductive reasoning. In an inductive argument, you have a series of premises that support, or they appear to support a general conclusion, but they don't necessarily completely disprove it. So the example here says 90% of dogs have fur. Rover is a dog. Rover has fur. So if you're kind of confused right now about wait, what's wrong with that? A part of that is that that logical fallacies, they're not always super blatant. They can be very subtle and very on the surface. So sometimes it might be kind of hard to detect it. So the conclusion here in that statement about Rover, it's highly likely that Rover is a dog with fur because 90% of dogs have fur, but you're still only guessing, right? So you have to it has to be, if it's a statement, the guesswork has to be taken out if you don't have the full support in there. So unless the premises are entirely disproved, inductive arguments can fall on the scale that ranges somewhere between a very weak and a very strong argument. An inductive argument becomes a fallacy when the conclusion is treated as a fact instead of probability. It also becomes false when you have one or more premises that are incorrect. So let's go back to Rover. So how can we make that statement stronger? So it says 90% of dogs have fur. Rover is a dog. Rover has fur. So what else could you say? You could say 90% of dogs have fur like the dog Rover. But that's still kind of more an assumption. So what about 90% of dogs have fur? Rover is a dog. Rover is one of the 90% of dogs that have fur. Okay, because that leaves any room for doubt that he is one of the 90%, because you never know, because he could be one of the 10% that is a hairless dog. So never know. So think about, why is it important for us to think about and learn about these fallacies and the arguments? So the fallacies are not always going to be about dogs, right? And I'll have some much more important, and I don't want to say extreme, but I guess heavy examples, and others that are, kind of like this is the dog. So, but these can be used all over the board. And with some of the examples I give you, then you'll start to see like, oh, wow, I've seen this or that, and it will kind of make everything come together more. So when you learn to spot the fallacies, it's a really important skill to have. Like you said before, it's strengthening a muscle. And you find the red flags once you can start to detect those. And those red flags indicate whether an argument is invalid or valid, if it's unsound or if it's weak or something like that. So those little red flags, even if it's one, then that makes it flawed. So this is really handy to be able to spot these because, like I said earlier, that they could be really subtle. So these can be really hard to spot because on the surface, they make sense. But it's also important to know that they are very, very common. So what? Why are we still learning more about fallacies? Okay, don't, research what people say. Okay, so it's a little bit more than that. And it's very important. Some of this you might have, seen by people, especially in the past few years, that, people using these flaws in thinking in a manipulative fashion, which is common among people who are hate mongers, like hate groups and stuff like that. It's very, very common in propaganda. And these, hate groups, and they deliberately manipulate logic, and they deliberately use these logical fallacies with the sole purpose to convince people of their way, and they do not care if there's misinformation. They just have their objective, and that's all that matters. So to prevent yourself from, getting manipulated by these, or actually even better, if someone, tries to use these kinds of, tactics, flawed argumentative tactics on you, then you could like point it out and say, no, this is an example of blah, blah, blah. Therefore, your argument is flawed, which I actually did last week to someone on social media. So, logical fallacies. Let's look at these different types. I'm actually going to make this bigger so you can see it better. So, ad hominem, that's the first type. You see this one. I see this one a lot. Once we go through it, you might be like, oh yeah, I see that. So it actually means against the man. So for all of these, I'll have an example and then just kind of the questions that you need to ask yourself with that example, to kind of practice working through, but also in the future, if you're faced with that, what do you do? So the example of ad hominem is, how can people believe the theory of evolution when it's a well-known fact that Darwin cheated on his wife? So you need to ask yourself, what does Darwin's infidelity have to do with his ability as a scientist? If you're talking about Darwin as a husband, or his integrity, or, honesty in regards to personal things, that would probably be, fair game. But if you're just talking about science, then, there's no bearings on it. So you have to not go down the rabbit hole when people make that kind of argument. You just have to keep the objective in front of you and keep the topic of the argument, keep that in basically, in your line of vision the whole time. The next is alleged certainty. Or if someone's like, another one is, I know I'm right. So for example, everyone knows that girls are more emotional than boys. So you need to ask yourself, who is, quote, everyone? And what are their qualifications? And has this been scientifically proven? There are lots of questions you could ask here. So those are the kinds of questions you need to ask there. And sometimes it'll say, you'll see something that says, well, they say blah, blah, blah. Insert whatever it is that you've heard before. Okay, who are they? So in where, who is this? Who is the they? So these are definitely things that you need to ask and just kind of question. And the next is appeal to authority or misplaced expertise. So for example, LeBron James says, eat Wheaties cereal so you can be like me. So some of you are out right now running to Kroger or Walmart to go get your Wheaties because you love LeBron. But you need to ask yourself, LeBron is probably an excellent person to help you with advice on basketball, right? But, is he a registered dietitian? What gives him an authority on nutrition? So even though, now you might be saying, well, he has to eat a certain way to support, his athletic work that he does all the time, which is accurate. Does that make him an expert? Not necessarily, because he had to learn that from somewhere. So he was taught it, and he knows how to feed himself based off of how many probably thousands of calories he burns, in a day of practice and all that kind of stuff. And he knows how to feed his, for how much activity he has, for his age, for, being, a man of his size. All of these things go into account into how he feeds himself. And even with that, there could be someone who does the exact same thing as him, same age, everything, same activity, and he might still have to eat differently. So LeBron's an expert on his nutrition. He probably still doesn't have it all figured out. He probably has to have a doctor or someone help him. So he's still not an authority. So that's one thing you have to remember. The next is appeal to fear. This one is probably a common one that you see with a lot of people. In my opinion, it's probably one of the scariest ones, no pun intended. but it's one of those that definitely relies on the emotional appeals. And as I mentioned when we talked about argument, the emotional side of arguments, it is important because it works, right? But you cannot only rely on that, because then it becomes sensationalized, if you recall me saying that. And then if it's sensationalized, then, and if there are no facts or evidence to back things up, then it's like there's no boundaries almost. And it's just go wherever your emotions are taking you. So you have to have your brain involved. So the example here is, if we do not have mass immigration reform, pretty soon we will go bankrupt, because we'll all have spent all of our children's money on support for illegal aliens. So if you have a question like this, where it's an appeal to fear, or maybe you've actually had a discussion similar to this specific one. So you need to ask yourself, how do you know this would happen? Where is your proof? Like your evidence, facts, all that stuff. This type of reasoning is common, by the way, in hate literature. So when people say, how did Hitler get all those people, like how did he manipulate all these people to allow something on such a large scale as the Holocaust? How did he get that? How did he get all those people to do it, right? And logical fallacies in general are a huge part of it. But, this appeal to fear, that was a big one that he used. Appeal to popularity. This one's called bandwagging. If you are a sports fan, you have probably been told this, or you said it to someone, you're on the whatever bandwagon, whichever team you like. Go Steelers. So the example, don't be the last person on your block to buy, whatever, Clippermeister is the example I have here, lawnmower, the only lawnmower that tells your neighbors you care about the neighborhood as much as they do. So first, you're going to be the last person to buy it, or you don't want to be last, but then you have to keep up with the expectations of your neighbors. So those are two things that they're saying there. So you need to ask yourself, how is the argument trying to convince you? What are they trying to do to convince, or how are they trying to do this? So this ad not only wants you to buy into the ideas that without this mower, you'll be left out, but you also need to own it to prove to your neighbors that you have the same values as they do. So you could kind of, you might not care about lawnmowers. Okay, think about your phone, because statistically most people have an iPhone. I'm not going to give you an actual number, because then that would be a flaw in my evidence, right? But yeah, it's the most popular telephone. So, but how many people got on board with that? Yes, I love Apple products. Right now, I'm filming this on my MacBook, and I have my iPhone on my desk, and I have my iPad somewhere. I don't know, somewhere. But I love Apple products, so I'm not hating. But you have to think about, the bandwagon, the popularity, and, there are other phones that are really good phones that are just as good as Apple products. They just are different, but which one's the most popular? So which one do you probably want? Okay, so that kind of answers that. The next one is appeal to tradition. So the example is letting people into the downtown athletic club would be a disaster, because for 125 years, the club has been male only. So why should we break up with that tradition? So you need to ask yourself, does something that has always been a certain way mean it's right? And also the argument here relies on nothing more than tradition as the reason why women can't go to the club. The tradition is the only reason that they say it would be a disaster if women went. So there actually is no evidence. It's just a whole bunch of rotations around the moon, basically. The next is false dilemma. So the example is the purpose behind campus speech codes is to combat racism. Either you support our efforts to end hate speech or you're a racist. So this one, you kind of have to break it apart and kind of figure out, well, it says it's the title of this one's false dilemma. So it presents you with a false dilemma. So you need to ask yourself these different things. Are there really only two choices here? So this argument ignores the fact that although you may disagree with the speech codes, that you support, well, ignores the fact that even though you're disagreeing with this, that, excuse me, there aren't other ways that you can support the fight against racism. So there are, and there might be something in these certain speech codes that basically it governs how things are said. So, whoever it is could have an issue with that, but they're like, no, this isn't where we need to put our effort. We need to do this other thing. But the way it's being presented here is, well, either you're doing this or you're just, the racist, or you are a racist. So you have to avoid that kind of false dilemma, and it makes people think there are only two choices when oftentimes there are not only two choices. The next is post hoc. Sometimes it's called just post hoc, or the full name is post hoc ergo propter hoc. So literally it means that little bit there in Latin, translated from Latin. After this, therefore, because of this, which is basically X doesn't always lead to Y. So the example here is, studies have conclusively proved that 83% of people who have died in car accidents last year ate ice cream within a month of their wrecks. This figure strongly suggests that eating ice cream causes car wrecks. So you need to ask yourself, what other factors need to be considered here? Is there enough proof to support a direct link between eating ice cream and car wrecks? The fact that 83% of people who died in car wrecks had eaten ice cream the month before, it's not really sufficient evidence to conclude that this causes the wrecks. The next is slippery slope. So the example is, if we start to ban extremely violent and sexually explicit speech, then we will open the doors to a flood of censorship that will never stop. First, we will ban images of violent sexuality. Penthouse and Playboy will be next, then Chaucer, then Byron, and Shakespeare. So before long, we'll be living in a fascist state where nobody has any rights at all. So you need to ask yourself, how do you know this is going to happen? There is a huge leap here between banning extremely violent and explicit speech to a flood of censorship and living in a fascist state. So that's not even jumping from A to B, that's like A to Z. So you have to, and slippery slope is a really common one I see a lot. You have to really break down, okay, how are you saying we go from here to there? How do you know this is going to happen? So you have to break those things down. The next is third cause. So for example, every year when the asphalt starts to get sticky, people die of heat stroke. So it seems that the heat stroke is a disease caused by the fumes emitted by the sticky asphalt. So you need to ask yourself, what other factor is missing here? Could there be another cause? So the Z factor is, or the underlying, like the common denominator here, is that both of these things were caused by heat. So heat is the common denominator. So assuming that people are dying of heat stroke because of fumes ignores the important fact that both were caused by the heat. So you have to ask yourself, was there something else besides one or both of these things that could have caused this? The next is complex question. The example is, have you stopped lying to your friends? So you need to ask yourself, This single question is actually asking two things. Did you lie to your friends in the past, and have you stopped now? Whether you answer yes or no, you are in trouble. So yes means you have been lying, but you actually stopped. But no means you were lying and you still haven't stopped. So you really can't answer it correctly with a yes or no. So what you have to do is to break down this kind of question and answer each part separately. So you could say, if you have not been lying to your friends and you are not now, then you would just say, I am not lying to my friends and I have not in the past. So there's no need to stop. And that's how you kind of squash that.